Perfect. Okay. Some tech difficulties. Thank you for bearing with us.
Apologies to everybody for this small delay and also for the technical issues. The two screens would not work with each other, Jeff's computer and the big one over there. My name is Emmanuel Bonejayi. I'm the lead for Globalization research, and I'm delighted today to welcome Jeff Corntassel, who's going to talk to us about work that we're doing in Big Lab, that is big. And before we start, I would like to pay respect to Lankogan, Songis and Esquimalt people on whose territory the university stands, and the Lankogan Lansonet people whose continues to this day. And I just also acknowledge that I live here as a settler and a new member for many, many years. And today is a sunny day. It's cool and beautiful once again to work on this beautiful land. And with this, I give the floor to Jeff, who is really in it. So it's Jeff, the floor to you.
Still only got Jeff Ganohalidoh Corntassel Dagwadoa, Shaligi Yetli Gwenasai, Echoda Galski Goi. So hello everyone. My name is Jeff Corntassel, and Wado Emmanuel for doing the land acknowledgement. I always think of land acknowledgement as a form of diplomacy, the ways that we engage with the peoples of this territory and the ways that we respect their self-determining authority. So thank you for that and starting us off in a good way. And I think my slides are up. I can't quite see them on my side. Okay, just give me 1 second here. I can't seem to advance them. That's my only. Oh, is this it? Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. All right. Excellent. Thank you all for coming today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Indigenous internationalism. The title, Inherently International, is really coming from Leanne Simpson, and as she thinks about Anishinaabeg internationalism. But as Indigenous peoples, we are nations, about 5,000 nations throughout the world. And we are international in the sense that we engage with each other in diplomatic exchanges. These exchanges might rise to the level of treaty, but they might also be protocols, it might be diplomacies. They're the ways in which we renew our relationships. And those relationships don't stop with human interactions. So we think of plants as having their own nations, animal nations. We think of the land and water as also having that agency. And so really this talk is to give you kind of an overview of some of the work that we're doing and in our Indigenous internationalism kind of section of BIG, and also provide some future directions for the research that we're doing. Okay. All right, I advanced the slide successfully, so it's already a success. Ayetli, for Cherokees, that means nationhood or nation. And it has a lot of deep meanings. One level, it means the center of things, where things come together, but it also means half. And it's the half that's probably the most interesting. There's the public-facing half, the kind of elected governance, the chief and council, if you will. And then there's the hidden half, which is often our family relations, our clan relations, are the ways that we relate to our kin. And so I think of nation as really embodying Indigenous internationalism, because we've got those multiple dimensions to our communities. And there is the public facing side, but there's also the hidden side, the side that where we engage in ceremony, the side where we relate to the land and water in different ways. And I'm going to use this story just to give you an illustration of that. It's called How Medicine Came to the People. And it was, some time ago, Cherokees were hunting. They would often hunt white-tailed deer, and they forgot their obligation to the deer nation. And so they began overhunting the deer. They began disrespecting the deer. Usually there was always an agreement that they would provide tobacco when they took a deer, when they killed a deer, and they would honor the family of that deer. They began forgetting those things. They began forgetting that they had this obligation to the deer nation. So the deer noticed this, and they held a council with other animals. And all these other animals, blue jay and rabbit, and all these other animals were present at this council, and they were deciding, what do we do with this problem that we have? Cherokees have forgotten their obligation. Caitlin, was there some? Oh, okay, sorry. uh, they forgot their obligation, and what's the penalty for that? And the animals were thinking amongst themselves. Bear said, "Well, we found this bow and arrow. Maybe we can use their weapons against them." And you can imagine a bear trying to pull back on a bow with those big claws. It was really a problem. So bear said, "Well, maybe I can clip my claws." And and the animal said, "No, that's way too complicated." Uh, and then suddenly Blue Jay said, "I know what we can do." Because Blue Jays always have something to say. And he said, "We'll give them disease." And so the animals started thinking about that, and they said, "Okay, that's what we'll do. That's the penalty for really ignoring our sacred compacts." And so the Cherokees became very sick, and they didn't understand why. They'd forgotten those obligations. They'd forgotten, even what got them into this kind of disaster. And so the plant nations noticed that the Cherokees were ill. They were kind of helpless. They were really vulnerable. And so the plant nations came together in their own council and said, what we're going to do is we're going to give them medicine to help combat these diseases. They need to survive. And so plants basically provided Cherokees with medicine so that they could heal from these diseases. And to this day, the plants are one of our strongest allies. And so sometimes if you're in the woods and it's a still day, if there's kind of like today where there's no wind, and you see one plant kind of moving, that's usually a sign that that plant is kind of calling out to you for medicine. And so, this is a simple story, but it tells a lot about diplomacy, right? We broke our treaty as Cherokees, and we broke it not with other humans, we broke it with the animals. And the animals held their own council. And so the animals made a determination. And to this day, I'd say our alliances with animals are often kind of unsteady. They're often a little bit, how would I say it? A little bit unstable sometimes. With plant nations, we have really strong kind of alliances. And so we have to constantly renew those commitments, renew those relationships. And so much in the same way, I think of Indigenous internationalism as really that constant renewal of those commitments we have to other nations, whether they be plants, animals, the land itself, or other humans. This is the logo for our unit, Indigenous Internationalism, that's done by Chaz Elliott Tomasing. And I think this really encompasses some of the work that we're doing and are going to do. You have the canoe as kind of the bridge. The canoe is kind of linking different worlds, linking different communities, different nations, if you will. And the water is kind of that unifier. And then you also have the weavings. And so those weavings can be our stories. They can be the ways that we relate our sacred living histories. And then you have the ancestors and the land there, really reminding us about the stories and how they're embedded in the landscape. And so, Indigenous internationalism is kind of a large umbrella term or concept, really to give us new openings for thinking about trade, thinking about new forms of solidarity, thinking about new maybe ways to approach climate change, thinking about different ways that we express our self-determining authority. And I really like the late Tomasingtet, or he's actually the father of Chas Eliot. He used to refer, these are some of the poles that you might see at the Victoria Airport. And he referred to them as silent ambassadors. And you can think of poles in some ways as boundary markers, but you can also think of them as stories, as part of the landscape. And the ways that families demarcate their territories that they're caring for, the ways that they express their sovereign crested authority that are inscribed in these poles. Another line of work that's really been engaged with by Rachel George and Andrew Ambers has been travel journeys. And travel journeys is really, the embodiment of internationalism. It's the ways that we travel through our different territories, but also asking for permission to come ashore, right? And I've witnessed travel journeys. I haven't been on the journey myself, but you can check out Rachel and Andrew's piece in the special issue of Big Review, and you can think about the different ways that that kind of those kind of water seascapes and water relationships are engaged with. Another story I wanted to share with you is really is told by Cheryl Bryce, but it's about Stakaya the wolf. And again, this is something we could talk about later, but it really expresses it's a more contemporary story, but it expresses the different layers of Indigenous internationalism. I don't know if you know this, but around 2012, there's a wolf, a single wolf living on what's known as Discovery and Chatham Islands, Songhees Glitches. And so the wolf was hunting for food, was in a sense staying around the island, and was there for about 8 years. And during this time, as Cheryl describes it, there's another person that asked for permission to access Songhees land to photograph the wolf. This person's name was Cheryl Alexander, and she was denied access by the Songhees Nation. Rather than take that at face value, she continued to trespass on Songhees land and created sort of little tours so that people from other countries could see this wolf. And she was constantly taking pictures of so again, this is a Songhees perspective of a story that's been kind of overshadowed by Cheryl Alexander's perspective on this wolf. So the wolf was actually chasing away the migratory geese. And the migratory geese were actually eroding some of the shoreline, right? So the wolf was actually helping to restore the ecosystem of this island by chasing away the geese. And so the Songhees had a kind of an unspoken agreement that they would leave the wolf alone, right? They would just watch it from afar. They would allow the wolf to have its own space. Almost akin to a treaty, right? That you have your own territory that you're going to live on, and we have ours as well, and we'll maintain that kind of respectful distance. So in the meantime, the wolf became more and more used to tourists coming around. Cheryl Alexander would put food out to kind of bait the wolf, right? To get the wolf closer so that people could get that ideal shot, that ideal photo. And over time, the wolf left the island, and in 2020, it was shot by a hunter out of season. And anyway, there's a whole bunch of things that went wrong there. And so the wolf's remains were never returned to Songhees Nation. So this is kind of an unfinished story, right? So as of 2020, the Songhees Nation formally asked for a rematriation of the wolf's remains, and they never complied. So this has a whole bunch of different layers to it. You could think of at one level, there's kind of an individual who is going against Songhees jurisdictional authority or Songhees self-determination. And this person is also the one who has published books on, she uses the word Takaya, which is kind of a shortened version of Stakaya. She's used the name, and she has been recognized as kind of the official documentarian of the wolf. And yet there's this whole different side of the story from a Songhees perspective. And so really, if I were to get at the purpose of this project, it's really to provide more of the Indigenous perspectives on these topics that we often only see one side to, right? That we often see a side that's more dominant in a maybe mainstream media or in particular formats like, you know, books or articles. And so, yes, Takaya is a tragic story. It also has the element of, you know, protocols amongst, you know, Songhees with the animal nations. It has the aspect of returning those remains. And so, you know, the government of Canada, or in this case, BC Conservation, right, has not returned those remains. And so there's all sorts of different layers. You could probably do a whole dissertation on this one story of Stakaya. And really, that's kind of what we want to get at with this project is to, you know, not just focus on Stakaya, obviously, but focus on those stories that remain untold or remain kind of marginalized in mainstream accounts. And if you do want to, you know, take a look at a memorial for Stakaya, this is at Cattle Point, also known as Camas Point. Kent Laforme, who did this beautiful granite memorial, and you could see that tube or that kind of hole through the center of it. That's pointing directly at Klitsches, right? So it's pointing directly at the island where the wolf. So it forces your eyes to that landscape and to that place. And so it's a beautiful memorial, and it's a you can see the wolf. You have to go, you know, in the daylight, but you can see the wolf on different parts of the memorial, along with other parts of the landscape and seascape. But again, reminding us of our obligations to the peoples of this territory, and also the tragedy that can occur when you don't follow these protocols, right? When you disregard these protocols. All right, zooming back to Cherokee Nation. In 2024, Cherokees signed a 5-tribe wildlife management reciprocity agreement. And this is really about our ability to hunt and fish on each other's territory. To give you some background, we had lots of treaties with the US government around hunting and fishing. And these were, in a sense, disregarded. And so in their place, when Oklahoma became a state, so all of these 5 nations are in Oklahoma. When Oklahoma became a state in the 1990s and beyond, the state began signing compacts with each of these nations over hunting and fishing. I would argue that those compacts undermine some of our self-determining authority. That is, they bypassed our treaty rights. but the compacts were subject to the approval of the governor. So here we would say premier, the equivalent of a premier. So the governor had to approve these compacts for hunting and fishing, which are part of our livelihood and part of our treaty rights. So in 2021, Governor Stitt said, we're not going to renew any more compacts. I refuse to sign any further compacts, especially over hunting and fishing. Well, just prior to that was a kind of a famous court case called McGirt, and McGirt expanded the jurisdictional authority back to the original territory of those 5 nations. And so I'll show you the map here. You can see how large those 5 nations are when you look at Cherokee. Start talking about Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Muskogee. You can see how large that is in terms of territory in Oklahoma. It's almost, I think it's 19 million acres. So this court case opened the door to basically reaffirming the original size of our territories as nations, not for necessarily return of land, although that it has implications for that, but for jurisdictional authority. And so in the case of McGirt, it was jurisdiction over criminal cases of Indigenous peoples committing crimes against other Indigenous peoples. And so having that authority. However, with this compact, we go back to the compact, this agreement of 2024, we actually see the expansion of the hunting and fishing back to that original territory, right? And so this is not just limited to hunting and fishing, it's also reciprocity over wildlife management, protection, and it could be also used for protection of plants as well. So we could think of this as a pretty widespread agreement. It's a reaffirmation of Indigenous self-determination, and in a way, it's a refutation of Governor Stitt, he's the closest you can get to kind of an anti-sovereignty kind of leader as a governor. It's a refutation of his views on Indigenous sovereignty and a refutation of his presumed authority over Indigenous nations. And so it's a pretty powerful agreement, and these are the kinds of things I like to kind of examine or look at, because this is a significant event, and yet it's not going to necessarily show up on everyone's news feed, but it's another way in which we exercise our self-determining authority as Indigenous nations, and it involves animals. So the Buffalo Treaty, something I think you've probably all heard of the Buffalo Treaty. Yeah, I know Shokia has. Shokia is very familiar with the Buffalo Treaty. So the Buffalo Treaty is another example of Indigenous internationalism, and it was signed originally in 2014. It came about as basically a graduate student started this discussion with Leroy Little Bear and with other elders in the Blackfoot Nation over return of buffalo. And so she kind of initiated this. Leroy was one of her thesis advisors. She initiated this conversation, and over time they began to hold buffalo dialogues in different parts of the community. And the elders at some point, after about 3 or 4 years, said, a lot of the youth are singing songs about buffalo. They're learning the history of the buffalo, but they're not seeing the buffalo. So we need a treaty. And so it came about in 2014. About 8, wasn't just about 8, it was 8 Blackfoot nations on either side of the US-Canadian border signed onto this treaty. And the goal was quite simple, to honor that sacred relationship with the buffalo. It's almost like the treaty with the deer in some ways. the Deer Nation in Cherokee, to honor that sacred relationship with the buffalo, as well as, have the buffalo guide the Blackfoot Nations in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of research, right? So there's several elements. If you read this treaty, it's really pretty innovative. There's several elements to this treaty. This is, if you want to see more, and I'm hoping we can have a screening at some point. Tasha Hubbard has done this great film called, is it Calling Back the Buffalo? Calling the Buffalo Back, I think is what it's called. Is that right? Does that sound right? Singing the Buffalo Back. Something back. Uh, Singing the Buffalo Back. Anyway, beautiful film about not only the challenges that have occurred over time, but of course, the absolute decimation of buffalo. The buffalo is down to, there are only 232 buffalo at one point in the world, right? In the early 1900s, 232. And we've seen this steady increase and of course, return of buffalo to indigenous nations and to indigenous territories. And so it's a beautiful film that really kind of describes the larger historical and contemporary context for this, for the Buffalo Treaty. And so 8 signed on to it. I just recently went to the 10-year anniversary of the Buffalo Treaty, and there were 1,700 people that attended this. About 500 were youth, and 30 signatories to the treaty. So you start with 8. By 2025, I haven't seen the latest figures, but you have over 50 signatories of indigenous nations that have signed on to the treaty. And I was really curious. I asked Leroy if countries could sign on. And he said they could sign on, but Canada has chosen not to. And so, but other indigenous nations can sign on as well, right? And so it's really focused on indigenous nations. Here you see on the left, or in the center there, is Leroy, and that's his relative Angela, and then I'm on the right there. But you can see Leroy on the far left, kind of guiding people into the treaty signing. And so Leroy has been one of the main kind of drivers behind this treaty. And it was a 3-day event. And the goal was really to lead up to the signing of the treaty, which is renewed every year through ceremony and through song. One of the interesting things is we held buffalo dialogues in each of these teepees, and each of the teepees had different kind of topics. So some were focused on health and well-being, some were focused on research methodology, some were focused on education, and some were focused on food sovereignty, right? So you'd choose which teepee you wanted to go into to have these conversations and essentially tell buffalo stories. And so interestingly, Cherokees had relationships with buffalo back in the day, woodland buffalo, but they were killed out. So there are no longer any woodland buffalo. But more recently, it was about 2016, Cherokees received a buffalo herd to our nation. And so we have about 3,500 buffalo, but we don't have the stories that go with them. So there are a lot of, well, we probably do, but I haven't heard any of the stories that go with them, right? So we don't have that kind of long connection to buffalo. We lost it somewhere along the way. And so I see this as a form of, possibly revitalizing that connection. And so one of my goals on the as a Cherokee citizen is to get Cherokee Nation to sign on to the Buffalo Treaty, right, at next year's event. And so that was one of my purposes for going to this, but also to witness what was happening. So we had these amazing talks in these teepees, and then kind of reported back, right, to larger community about what was happening in each community and how how the buffalo has impacted our lives. As I was driving back to my hotel, I saw this guy on the left side, just out there standing on his own. And so I pulled over the car. I almost drove into a ditch, but so shocked to see a buffalo. And took this picture. But it was a pretty powerful few days, and it culminated with the treaty signing. So I mentioned that Indigenous nations can sign on to the treaty, but also individuals can sign on as supporters. And so I signed on as a supporter. You can see on the left side the text of that treaty, and you sign on and write your nation. And long lines of people signing on. But each of these nations were signing on either for the first time or reaffirming, renewing their commitment to the treaty through ceremony. And so I think, the Buffalo Treaty is really coming from, I'd say, the grassroots, in the sense that it's coming from the stories, it's coming from the elders and the youth, and that has been perpetuated over the past 10 years, and I see that continuing on into the future. There's been talk about a salmon treaty. So there was someone from the coast, I forgot which nation, but one of the Coast Salish nations that was out there at the Buffalo Treaty that wants to emulate the text of that treaty for salmon. And you can think about different treaties that might take place out here, whether it's salmon or camas, Quetlal. You could think of orca treaties, right? You could think of all sorts of different treaties that might be formalized, even, to reflect those long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have with them. And so I think I'll close here, other than to say, Bodo, thank you for listening. And I think this area of Indigenous internationalism is really going to continue to be animated by further work around. We're looking at camas trade right now, and so we're looking at the widespread trade of camas or Quetlal across different nations, and we want to look at how far that trade network extends. So looking at how it extends to different nations in the state of Washington, for example, different nations in Montana and elsewhere, right? As well as the Grease Trail. And so Andrew Ambers and I are doing this project around trade. Andrew and Jerry Ambers are doing work around activism and really looking at the ways that Indigenous activism in the 1960s and 70s has set the tone for today's forms of mobilization, and really laying the groundwork for some of the mobilizations that are occurring today. And so those are just a couple of examples of the work that's coming out of this, out of our group, and then of course continue to have a conversation with the folks who do border studies, and understanding some of the work that Shalkia does, and Emmanuel and others around border crossings and the ways that borders impact Indigenous peoples and nations. So more work to come. This is kind of a broader overview or a sample of the kinds of, not only the philosophy behind the work, but the kinds of work that can come out of this. So, Wado, thank you.
Thank you so much.